Okay, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling a really significant, often challenging, and frankly, quite hidden issue: parental alienation.
hmm It's something that has, well, the sources state it has profound impacts on families, and particularly the children caught in the middle.
And we're unpacking this based on a specific stack of sources provided by Edwin Duggan, who's described as a human rights advocate.
That's right. These materials include excerpts from his website, his writings. They focus both on what parental alienation is, according to him, and a particular proposed UK law aiming to address it.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to walk you through what these sources say. How parental alienation is defined here, the effects it's described as having.
And specifically, the details of a proposed piece of legislation championed by Mr. Duggan, the Parental Alienation Prevention and Resolution Act.
Think of this as your shortcut, really, to understanding this specific perspective on the issue and the proposed solution being advocated for in these materials.
So let's explore what's here.
Okay, so who is Edwin Duggan, according to these sources?
Yeah.
He's presented as a human rights advocate and an anti-knife crime campaigner based in North Wales.
Right. The material mentions he holds an LLB Hans degree. That's an honors law degree. And his work covers areas like human rights, law, contemporary politics. Quite a range.
Yeah, and the sources also note he's published a book, Breaking the Chain, Your Life, Choice, and Future, which is available now.
And he's apparently been shortlisted for Best Awareness Campaign at the True Crime Awards in London. That's coming up soon, June 5th, 2025.
But what really stands out from the material, I think, is his stated personal connection to this issue of parental alienation.
Yes, he writes quite powerfully about experiencing its devastating effects over the past 5 years. He feels the groundwork for this might have been woven earlier.
How so?
Well, as he puts it, his role as a parent was minimized. He gives examples, like being told he wasn't the primary parent, even though he says he shared equal legal and factual responsibility.
You can really sense from his writing how that experience fuels his advocacy now.
Definitely. He states he witnessed the intense emotional and psychological toll it takes on a parent and expresses, real fear for the long-term toll on the child involved.
He uses strong words: deep-seated pain, loss of trust, and severed relationships. Calls it incredibly damaging and fundamentally unjust.
And the sources are quite careful to point out that while his advocacy stems from this personal experience,
Right.
he proposes this legislation not for his own sake, but with the explicit stated goal of preventing other families from enduring the same kind of anguish he describes.
So it's framed as a fight for child welfare, promoting healthy relationships with both parents.
Exactly.
Okay, moving from the personal background to the definition itself. How exactly is parental alienation defined within these specific sources?
Well, the material defines it clearly as a form of emotional abuse. It's where one parent actively manipulates a child
Manipulates them out.
to unjustly reject the other parent. The language used is pretty strong. It's called one of the worst actions any parent can inflict on a child. Yeah, the stated intent is to disrupt and ultimately sever the child's fundamental bond with their other parent, and crucially, without any legitimate reason.
Unjustly rejecting. That seems to be a really core component here. It's not just, say, a child naturally preferring one parent for a time.
No, the sources stress the unjustified part. What are the key characteristics or signs of this, according to the material?
Good question. What should people look for?
Well, the sources list several indicators. First, there's that unjustified rejection you mentioned. The child becomes strongly aligned with one parent, they call this the preferred parent,
Okay.
and rejects the other, the alienated parent, even when there isn't a valid reason, like abuse or neglect by that alienated parent.
So the child's viewpoint isn't really based on genuine issues with the targeted parent's behavior.
Exactly. The sources say it's driven by psychological manipulation from the alienating parent.
What kind of manipulation?
Things like false accusations, maybe exaggerating minor issues way out of proportion, or applying emotional pressure to, turn the child against the other parent.
And this manipulation, it can lead to a really distorted view of the parents, I imagine.
It really can. The sources describe it resulting in something called splitting behavior.
Splitting.
Yeah, the child starts to see the world, or at least their parents, in black and white. One parent is entirely good, the other entirely bad. They might show unwarranted fear, hostility, or just outright disrespect towards the alienated parent.
And is the impact limited just to the parent-child relationship itself?
No, actually. The sources state that the damage can ripple outwards. It can affect the child's relationships with grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, other extended family members connected to the alienated parent.
So it can essentially fracture the whole broader family network around that parent.
That's the picture painted, yes.
Are there specific things like phrases or behaviors to look or listen for, according to the sources?
Yes, the material lists some observable signs. One is when the child repeats negative statements about the alienated parent that seem scripted.
Scripted, like they've been told what to say.
Kind of, yeah. Suggesting they've maybe been coached or are repeating adult language rather than expressing their own genuine thoughts or feelings.
Okay, what else?
Another is the child resisting or maybe outright refusing contact with the alienated parent, but without any clear or justifiable reason for doing so.
So not because that parent did something wrong, but just refusal.
Right. And finally, the child might show this kind of extreme loyalty to the alienating parent, even defending that parent's actions when they are harmful.
Wow. That combination, the manipulation, the rejection, the loyalty, it paints a really concerning picture.
It does.
Now, what does the material say about the stated effects of all this on the children themselves? Both, right now and long term.
The sources really emphasize significant long-term psychological consequences. Children can experience profound emotional distress, things like confusion, guilt, deep sadness over the loss of that vital relationship.
And this doesn't just fade away. It follows them into adulthood.
According to the material, absolutely. It can lead to identity struggles. Makes it difficult for them to form healthy relationships, trust others later in life.
That makes sense if your foundation is disrupted.
Exactly. And there's also a stated heightened risk of mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem.
The sources mentioned testimony from adults who went through this as children. What kinds of things did they report experiencing?
Yeah, the adult survivors, as cited in the material, they speak of a lasting impact. Things like chronic low self-esteem, a sense of unworthiness, ongoing difficulties with trust, and sometimes, unfortunately, turning to drug or alcohol abuse to mask their pain.
That's tragic.
And there's also a stated anger. Anger about being deceived, about being manipulated, about the alienated parent during those formative years.
The material refers to it as an appalling legacy.
Yes, and it's explicitly called an urgent child protection issue that remains hidden in plain sight in one of the sources.
Hidden in plain sight. That phrase really jumps out, doesn't it? It underscores the perceived nature of the problem, according to this material, that it's happening but maybe not being recognized.
Precisely.
Okay, so given that stated severity and the sense from the sources that it's not being adequately addressed currently, this brings us to the proposed legislative solution. What is this act called again?
It's titled the Parental Alienation Prevention and Resolution Act.
Right. And the stated aim of this specific proposal, what's it trying to achieve?
Based on the documents provided, its purpose is to actively safeguard the emotional and psychological well-being of children who are caught up in custody disputes.
Or residence disputes, they sometimes say.
Yes, residence disputes, by both preventing parental alienation from happening in the first place and directly addressing it when it does occur.
The preamble, the introduction to the act, it sort of sets the stage for why this is felt to be necessary, doesn't it?
It does. The material states that while parental alienation is perhaps gaining more recognition, the existing legal framework in the UK is presented as lacking the specific tools needed to effectively tackle it. So this proposed act is intended to fill this gap, essentially, by offering a structured and detailed approach which is built on the fundamental principle that a child's welfare and best interests are paramount, always.
Okay, let's unpack the specifics then.
Yeah.
The provisions outlined in the proposed act itself, as detailed in the sources. What's the first key element?
Okay, so the act begins by proposing a clear legal definition of parental alienation.
It needs to be clear legally. Right.
Exactly. This would explicitly define it as emotional abuse involving manipulation and that unjust rejection we talked about. And importantly, it would include specific examples of the kinds of behaviors that constitute it, like bad-mouthing the other parent, deliberately limiting contact, creating false narratives or stories about the other parent to the child. Things like that.
So a solid definition seems like the necessary foundation. How does the proposal suggest cases would then be identified and brought forward?
That's the second provision, identification and reporting. It suggests establishing standardized methods for recognizing the signs of PA.
Standardized methods, like checklists.
Could be, or protocols, including things like psychological assessments and direct observation. but crucially, it would introduce mandatory reporting requirements.
Mandatory reporting. For whom?
For professionals like teachers, counselors, social workers, it would oblige them to report suspected cases to Child Protective Services or the family court.
Ah, so it aims to bring the issue into the formal system much more reliably through mandatory reporting. Okay, what else is proposed?
Next up is training for professionals. The proposal mandates comprehensive training specifically for key figures.
Who are we talking about?
Family court judges, lawyers, social workers, mental health professionals, training them on how to recognize and effectively address parental alienation. And it also includes requirements for ongoing education, keeping up to date.
Ensuring those making the critical decisions have the right knowledge seems vital. What about directly assessing the child's specific situation in these cases?
That's covered by child impact assessments. The Act proposes making these assessments mandatory in all custody, residence, and access cases.
Mandatory in all cases.
In those types of cases, yes. The specific focus would be on evaluating whether parental alienation is potentially present or already occurring, and these assessments would need to be conducted by qualified mental health professionals.
Okay, so this seems designed to put the child's actual psychological reality front and center in legal decisions. What legal tools or remedies would the Act provide for the courts?
Right. The legal remedies section outlines several options. It would create clear legal pathways for alienated parents to seek court intervention.
What kind of intervention?
Things like modifying existing custody or residence orders, mandating supervised visitation for a time, perhaps, or using enforcement measures, potentially even punitive actions against an alienating parent in some circumstances.
And therapy.
Yes, the courts could also explicitly order therapeutic interventions like family counseling or specific reunification therapy aimed at repairing that damaged parent-child relationship.
So giving courts specific powers to intervene both therapeutically and legally. Beyond the courts, what kind of support is envisioned for the families affected by this?
The proposal includes a provision for support services. This means establishing access to services like counseling and mediation specifically tailored for PA cases.
Tailored support seems important.
Yes, and also parental education programs focused on healthy co-parenting after separation. It also suggests creating helplines and online resources, ways to get accessible, maybe even anonymous, advice and support.
It definitely sounds like a multi-pronged approach: legal system, professional training, direct support services. What about raising broader awareness among the public?
That's the final key provision mentioned: public awareness campaigns. The Act proposes initiating campaigns to educate the general public about the harmful effects of parental alienation.
Why is that seen as important?
Well, to promote better co-parenting practices generally and maybe help people recognize it, the idea is to involve schools, community groups, the media, really get the word out there, disseminate information and resources. Raising public understanding is seen as crucial for an issue described as often hidden.
Okay, a comprehensive set of provisions. How does the material suggest this act would actually be put into practice? Implementation.
The proposed implementation involves setting up a dedicated government body or maybe a task force.
What will they do?
They'd be specifically for oversight and enforcement of the Act. This body would need to work closely, collaborating with existing services, child protective services, family courts, support organizations.
Coordination seems key.
Absolutely. The material also emphasizes the need for regular monitoring and evaluation using data, research, feedback, along with periodic reviews to make sure the Act stays effective over time.
It's certainly a detailed framework laid out in these sources. The material also includes Edwin Duggan's personal view on how serious this issue is, doesn't it? His opinion.
Yes, one source quotes his strong opinion that parental alienation should be a criminal offense.
A criminal offense, that's a strong stance.
It is. He describes it explicitly as blatant child abuse and emphasizes its devastating consequences for the child and the irreparable harm, he says, it causes to the targeted parent.
And the material mentions his plans regarding Parliament.
Yes, it notes his intention to take this matter to Parliament and provides information on how people can contact him if they want to be kept informed or perhaps support any application he makes.
He's clearly very committed to seeing significant action taken on this. The sources also kind of bring it back to the overall vision of the Act at the end, don't they?
They do. The conclusion of the proposal itself reiterates the Act's overarching goals. essentially, to protect children from the damaging effects of parental alienation,
Okay.
promote healthy relationships between children and both parents, ensure that all custody and residence decisions are firmly rooted in the child's best interests, and ultimately foster a legal and social environment that genuinely supports family well-being.
And just to place this within the timeline presented in the sources again, the details of the proposed act itself were published, it says, November 13th, 2024.
Right, and there's a reference to a website update from May 15th, 2025.
And that other piece, the one calling PA a hidden child protection issue, specifically mentions Father's Day in the UK in the context of fathers being alienated.
Yeah.
So that gives a recent time frame for that discussion, although a precise publication date isn't given.
Yeah, understanding those dates helps ground the information and the campaign's timeline as it's presented in the sources we have.
So, stepping back for a moment, why might understanding this issue and this specific proposed legislative approach described in the sources, why might that matter to you, the listener?
Well, because it touches on a really fundamental aspect of society, doesn't it? Child welfare, how the legal system navigates these incredibly complex family dynamics, and the long-term psychological health of individuals.
Yep, absolutely.
So whether you're interested in social issues generally, potential policy changes in family law, or perhaps trying to understand challenging personal or family situations you might know of, this deep dive into these specific sources offers a detailed look at one particular perspective and a very concrete proposed solution to what's presented as a very difficult problem.
Absolutely. So we've covered how parental alienation is defined and described in these sources, the stated impacts it has. And we've taken a really detailed look at the provisions of this proposed Parental Alienation Prevention and Resolution Act, championed by Edwin Duggan, based on his experiences and research.
It's certainly clear from the material how severely this issue is viewed by the advocate and the call here for a robust, specific legal response.
Which leaves us with a final question to ponder, really drawn from the heart of this material we've explored. Given the stated devastating long-term impacts on children, as described here, and this strong call for specific legal measures like this proposed act, how does any society best navigate that incredibly delicate balance?
What balance is that?
The balance between parental rights and responsibilities on the one hand, and the absolute paramount need to safeguard a child's emotional and psychological well-being when families find themselves in these intensely difficult conflicts.
Yeah, that's the central tension, isn't it? Finding that right balance seems to be what drives this whole discussion.
Indeed. It's something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into these sources.